We have a big fight over that. We have a fight over open borders. They still want open borders. We're having a fight over men and women's sports, if you believe it. You would have thought they would have learned that it's not a good issue. And we have a fight in transgender, as you know, transgender for everybody.
Welcome back to Posting Through It, the podcast some people, mostly Mike, are calling the most trusted name in news. I'm Jared Holt.
And I'm the aforementioned Mike.
I'm going to give a couple shout outs to our newest Patreon members. These are at the platinum level. We have somebody using the screen name Fridge, Chargoond, I think is how this other one is said, and Kevin Harris. Thanks so much.
I know a Kevin Harris, and if that's that Kevin Harris, and I haven't spoken to him in a very long time, I want to say, what's up, bro? How's it going?
Thanks so much for your support on Patreon. Posting Through It is supported by our listeners. We can't thank you all enough. You can go to our Patreon page, sign up to support us. The link's in the description, and what you get in return is an extra episode every week. Last week's was about ICE and had a really fun reading series from writer, drinker, Jeffrey Ingersoll.
Who wants to kill you? You may not know who he is, but he wants to kill you.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun despite the subject matter.
But on our last Monday episode, Jared, we talked a little bit about this panic around Antifa and the criminalization of anti-fascism. And that's still going on, obviously. It's still one of the biggest things going in MAGA land right now.
Yeah, we can report nothing has meaningfully changed in the last week since...
They don't love anti-fascism.
They were unconvinced by our episode.
But we briefly touched on the crossover between anti-fascism and transgender people, trans people, who have become this huge scapegoat for MAGA. And you'll see people on X refer to something they call Trantifa, which is quite literally not a thing. I mean, it's a pretty bigoted statement or whatever. And you'll see people like Andy No, Jared, say this person is a member of Trantifa, which there's so many layers to unpack there. The first one is there are no members of Antifa, which I think we safely covered with Chris Mathias last week. But there are also no members of Trantifa because Trantifa isn't actually a thing. It's just a made up kind of mutation in the mind of a bigot.
It is just a complete fabrication and a lazy one at that, too. It's from people like Andy No, who made his bread and butter scaring your conservative uncles about Antifa coming to their town square and beheading all the small business owners. And, when trans people really became punching bags in right-wing media, Andy looks at this and it's like, trans, Antifa, and then does this like Power Rangers thing where he just like slams it together and they form Trantifa. It's so cynical. It's not creative. It's just so stupid, but it's dangerous because our political leaders are buying into it.
Right. That's the biggest concern. I have seen some people on Blue Sky, like ironically being like, I'm the mayor of Trantifa, or I'm the commander of Trantifa,
Mayor
or whatever.
McCheese of Trantifa.
But, like I wouldn't put it past them to start, outlawing Trantifa as a thing. And I'm not even sure what it actually means. On our premium episode, we referred to some graffiti that's on the walls in Portland that is a little bit spicy, that sort of intimates something about trans women. It's a little dirty. You can go to our premium episode to find out what that was. But these are the type of things that are consuming them and obsessing them. So today we are going to talk about transgender Americans More specifically, we're going to talk about how our trans brothers and sisters became the ultimate scapegoat for MAGA.
Like any fascist or authoritarian movement, MAGA has scapegoats. People that MAGA's leaders, from Trump to various online propagandists, depict as being part of a sinister outgroup that's coming for them.
This, of course, includes Black people at times, immigrants from Latin America, feminists, leftists, Muslims, Arabs, in some corners, Jews too, even though there are prominent Jews in Trump's orbit. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people.
Yeah, that's like most of America.
But perhaps no group faces a more concentrated dehumanization than trans people.
In a traditional legislative sense, meaning not just hateful rhetoric, this started a long time ago. In 2017, Trump announced a ban on trans people in the military. And from 2018 to 2020, the GOP systemically rolled back Obama-era protections for trans students that enabled them to do things like use the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. In 2020, they removed non-discrimination protections for trans people that were installed under the Affordable Care Act, meaning their health care access was compromised.
But MAGA 2 has gotten worse, if that's possible. There's an executive order that mandates that the federal government treat gender as an immutable binary based on, quote, biological sex. Another executive order that protects children from chemical and surgical mutilation. Another executive order bans transgender individuals from military service. Another executive order seeks to keep men out of women's sports. A legal push to prevent trans people from choosing their own sex markers on passports.
So all of that's happening at the federal level, and it's also happening across the nation in state governments, removing civil rights protections for people in Iowa, banning gender-affirming care for minors. There's a website called translegislation.com that has tracked 998 anti-trans bills across 49 states. 122 of those bills have passed.
And the panic is kind of hard to understand, maybe if you're not a huge bigot, because trans people make up a very small percentage of the population, and the number ticks up slightly for teenagers, which may be a factor in why these people are getting obsessed with it. Also, trans people have become more visible in film and TV with trans actors like Laverne Cox, Hunter Schafer, MJ Rodriguez, and Elliot Page. Laverne Cox, who also was in a movie that was adapted for one of my plays.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. Publishers are selling memoirs by trans authors, and the publication Them reported in 2022 that porn involving trans people, women in particular, became the third most popular category in the US. I don't know how that was exactly categorized, but it's very visible there. And so you can safely guess a lot of MAGA bigots who say things out of one mouth are also that and the other. And we've had some of the people that we cover on this show have had like kind of scandals with their base for kind of, I don't know, whatever, having, being associated with porn involving trans people like Nick Fuentes and Alex Jones.
But it's influencers like Nick Fuentes, like Alex Jones, and, libs of TikTok, there's too many to name, that have led the charge in dehumanizing trans people. Almost every MAGA influencer these days takes shots at trans people, but some have taken a starring role at the front of the pack. Matt Walsh, a contributor at the Daily Wire, certainly one. He put a 2022 film out called What is a Woman, which has kind of become, the centerpiece, the sort of, crown jewel to these people in their efforts to scare America about trans people. The mayor of DC was testifying before Congress this week, and I think it was Nancy Mace was like, well, why should we trust you when you can't even say what a woman is? It's just this stupid punchline they have. You've got people like Andy Ngo, who's openly gay. You've got Tim Pool, the late Charlie Kirk. Riley Gaines is another person people might have seen, a former collegiate swimmer who didn't she get like a third place or something? It's not like she would
doesn't
have.
seem like the greatest swimmer of all time.
No,
But MAGA assumes that she is, and then the only reason she wasn't the greatest swimmer of all time is somehow because of trans people.
Yeah. This woman would have been Katie Ledecky getting gold medals if it weren't for those darn trans swimmers. And of course, Chaya Raichik, aka Libs of TikTok, who built an entire brand around trying to shock and outrage people that follow her with videos of trans people.
And then there are people who, in my opinion, had no business doing any of this stuff. They had their own lives and stuff like that, but decided to go all in on transphobia. You got your J.K. Rowling, Graham Linehan, who is the creator of the IT Crowd.
A quick story about Graham Linehan. He got really upset with me one time. I guess at one point he was a fan of my work on the radical right. And then I compared him to Sargon of Akkad, the dead brain British YouTuber who for the longest time before his identity was known used an avatar of a little, I guess ancient mask of some kind, and would be like, immigration will be the downfall of Western culture, and Graham got pretty offended that I compared him to this guy. But once again, as in many points in my career, validated.
Yeah, these are among a whole host of people who people once identified as, I guess, or thought of as liberals, right? They thought of them as being kind of, in the liberal sphere of things, and then all of a sudden they just got obsessed with trans people, and then it changed people's perception of them. Then there's also the kind of Barry Weiss crowd, Jesse Singal, who's made basically his entire career writing about trans people. And, Elon Musk, of course, who was beloved by liberals early in his life and is basically, depending on whose narrative you want to buy, there's so many, the story is so big about Elon, but may have actually bought X just because he was so mad online about trans things. Yeah, it's kind of hard to process mentally.
Well, the consequences of this onslaught has been to try to make trans people seem scary to the public. I remember when I started my career, the line of attack on trans people was that they were confused, mentally ill people. This was used by, the religious right, evangelical activists in particular, to prop up arguments about why the government shouldn't recognize trans people or support them. And that's a pretty gross, condescending argument, no doubt. But it was kind of coated in this sheen or this sort of disingenuous pretense of just being, concerned about mental health and wanting to do right in a mental health setting or whatever.
Yeah, they definitely really care about mental health on the right.
Yeah. Med beds,
Yeah, that's right. Med beds for the Patreon listeners will know about med beds. But since the return of the decade, things have gotten, taken a more sinister turn. Today, trans people are discussed in right-wing media as a violent threat to public safety. This is especially clear after Charlie Kirk was murdered by Tyler Robinson, or we believe by Tyler Robinson, actually. He still has to go to trial. When right-wing press and social media influencers raced to claim that trans people somehow deserve the blame for this crime.
Yeah, so influencers like Andy No, who we talked about on the episode, the last one, a little bit, have spent recent years trying to portray transgender people not as mentally ill as the GOP might have done in previous years, but as a extremist threat. They use the same kind of language to talk about trans people that we might use on this podcast to talk about white supremacist mass shooters and that sort of thing. I don't think those are really the same.
It really picked up in a major way after the 2023 shooting at the Covenant School in Nashville, Tennessee. A former student at the religious private school killed 6 people during their attack, including 3 students who were just 9 years old. It's complete horror. As more information about the shooting started to come out, it began to seem like the attacker had expressed an interest in transitioning their gender. In fairness, there does seem to be some credible information suggesting that was true. Right-wing media had a field day with this, portraying the school shooting as a transgender attack on Christians. It's worth noting that an investigative report about the shooting was published earlier this year, and the police didn't agree with that conclusion. Instead, understanding the shooter as somebody who struggled with mental illness and planned their attack with the goal of making themselves famous.
I actually looked at these narratives at my prior employer for a piece they spiked over concerns that I'll just say they spiked it, and I completely disagreed with the rationale there. There's a story there, but probably for another day. I'll try to summarize kind of what I've found. So basically, the short of it is that posts that associate transgender people and queer people with mass shootings and terror attacks became enormously popular after that 2023 shooting at the Covenant School. These narratives existed before, to be clear, but they really took off online in a major way after that. It's all over the right-wing internet now, and you can pretty much count on somebody to blame quote-unquote gender ideology for any deadly attack that makes the news, whether it's true or not, and it's usually not. To make matters worse, the people who promote this defamatory nonsense are running the country right now, and the Republican establishment seems to be fully on board with using this narrative to rob our trans brothers and sisters of their rights and their respect and their safety.
The Heritage Foundation, as part of Project 2025, proposed a new category called Transgender Ideology-Inspired Violent Extremism, TIVE. They call this gender ideology, and they want to police trans people like they're ISIS. This has received some fresh attention since Charlie Kirk was killed because the Heritage Foundation started pushing for this again. As we record this episode, this idea is not confirmed to be how the federal government is approaching transgender issues, but I'm not sure it would surprise anyone if the Trump administration started exploring this possibility more closely.
People who claim transgender people are increasingly responsible for violent attacks are fudging the numbers in a way that I, as a professional researcher, find intellectually insulting. For example, to support this transgender ideology-inspired violent extremism thing that they're pushing for, the Heritage Foundation has put out claims that 50% of, quote, major non-gang school shootings since 2015, unquote, have involved a transgender shooter or a trans-related motive. The publication Wired looked into this, and surprise, the numbers didn't seem to gel. The Heritage Foundation, to calculate those stats, only counted 8 school shootings. So this 50% number they have is 4 out of 8. And Mike, would you say, just taking a guess, have there been more or less than 8 major school shootings in the last 10 years?
I'm going to go with more. That's just my gut, largely because my idea of the day is I wake up in the morning and I have my yogurt muffin and my grapefruit juice and my black coffee, and then by like 11 o'clock there's something on CNN where a bunch of children are just running out of a school and there's a breaking news banner.
So here's a stat I have more confidence in. The Gun Violence Archive lists 5 mass shootings by transgender or non-binary people since 2013. That is less than 0.1% of the mass shootings that organization has counted in that period. So simply put, this is just not a thing. In fact, trans people, categorically, are way more likely to be killed by gun violence than to be responsible for it.
Well, that's not stopping these guys. Trump has floated the idea of taking guns away from people who the government thinks might be transgender. Destroying the progress trans people have made in the last decade is a clear priority of today's Republican Party, and the tone feels as vicious as I personally can remember. I want to point out it's so vicious that I believe, Jared, the National Rifle Association kind of stepped in to defend trans people, obliquely. They didn't. They just did it in a sort of passive way when a comment was made about taking transgender people's guns away.
Never thought I would see the day. Hate and lies about trans people have been pivotal talking points in recent GOP campaigns. You can look back on the last few election cycles in this country and see that it is at the forefront of their communication strategy. And hate for queer people has been an animating force in far-right organizing around issues like, as we discussed a couple weeks ago with Kelly Jensen, book bans. This era of MAGA has given rise to people like Lives of TikTok as major stars, whose entire bit is hate for queer people. Groomer was popularized as a slur, a false claim that queer people are systemically, grooming children for sexual abuse, and so on. I mean, it feels inescapable in a lot of senses.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say one thing to our audience before we bring on Gillian, who you're going to really like, somebody I'm a big fan of, which is if you think in the back of your head, like, this is a sad situation, but it doesn't really have anything to do with me, what I would say to you is this is really the tip of the spear, whatever cliche you want to throw at it. If you are concerned about the fascist movement that is growing in this country, trans people are first in line, and they have been under the gun really since going back to the start of Trump's rise.
So with all that said, let's get to our interview with Gillian Branstetter. We're excited to have Gillian Branstetter joining us on Posting Through It today. Gillian is a communication strategist at the ACLU. She has worked at the Women's Law Center, National Center for Transgender Equality. She's experienced spokesperson, media strategist, and has written for all kinds of media outlets like CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, and on and on. But Gillian wanted us to stress that she's appearing here in a personal capacity today, not as a spokesperson for the ACLU, but Gillian rocks. So welcome, Gillian.
Thank you so much, Jared and Mike. Great to be with you.
Thank you for coming. A lot has happened around trans issues, as we introed on this podcast already. But could you give us an idea of just what has happened just in terms of legislation really since Trump took power a second time? What is the legislation that has been proposed? What has been passed? What has it changed for trans people in a literal sense?
Over the last 5 years at the state level, folks may know that we've been targeted by literally over 2,000 pieces of legislation that have been introduced, and strictly or broadly attacking LGBT rights, but very principally focused on the rights of transgender people and transgender young people especially. So across the country, trans people have been losing access to the healthcare they rely on. They've been losing their freedom to be themselves in public spaces. Schools have been made less safe for them. It's been less safe for them to be out at work by virtue of laws that are criminalizing their healthcare, that are criminalizing what restroom they use, that are censoring their speech. So when Donald Trump was elected and then inaugurated, it was abundantly clear that he was going to do his damnedest to take a lot of that national. A lot of this was, of course, also laid out in Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation and others. So it wasn't a surprise when on his first day back in office, he signed a number of executive orders targeting our rights. The first of which can seem really abstract. It is nominally declaring that there are only two genders in the United States, that these genders are immutable, meaning they cannot be changed, and that they are assigned at conception. which is, of course, a phrasing tipping off that this is being written by the very same people who have banned abortion and want to enforce fetal personhood laws to control pregnant people's well-being as well. But as abstract and sort of like almost like philosophical as the question of what is gender and how many are there can seem, the end result of that was basically eroding protections that trans people and organizers had fought for at the federal level, ranging from workplace protections for federal workers to what gender markers go onto our identity documents, to really broad and sweeping measures like our ability to access healthcare without discrimination, our rights under non-discrimination laws, our rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution, our ability to report harassment at our workplaces. And over the ensuing weeks, the implementation of that order led to just that. Probably the most alarming to me has been the effort to defund medical providers who offer gender affirming care. So it's a little different than the Hyde Amendment, which folks may know, which prohibits federal funding for abortion services. So if you are a Medicaid patient and you go to a doctor to receive, or a Planned Parenthood clinic or wherever to get an abortion, Medicaid will not provide coverage for that abortion. What they want to do for transgender people's care, and specifically they targeted the care of people under the age of 19, is prohibit any provider of that care to a person under 19 from receiving any federal funds. So the millions upon, I used to be a healthcare reporter in central Pennsylvania, the millions upon millions of dollars that hospitals rely on from Medicare, Medicaid, and any number of federal programs, they would be locked out of that entirely if they work with young trans people and their families to provide them healthcare.
So it's kind of to scare them.
Well, yeah, to lean on them in the same way that we've seen them do now with the universities, with corporations, with law firms, basically trying to make it untenable for them to do anything but comply with the order and drop these patients. And many of these hospital networks have. So now, in addition to the 25 states which have criminalized the healthcare for transgender young people at the state level, you now have, even in the states where it's still legal, many providers and hospitals refusing to provide this care, not because it's medically feasible, because of course it is, not because it's within their best medical judgment, because of course it is. These are some patients that may have been working with for literally a decade, may have known them for most of their lives, that they now have to drop for fear of losing the funds that allows them to open their doors. And it's kind of a perfect example of how Trumpism operates in like a real politic way, which is making anyone's solidarity with a marginalized group dangerous to their own well-being or their own stability, and forcing them into a position to drop them. And that has led to not just restrictions in access for trans people under 19 and their families, because as we've seen with abortion, when you impose any kind of restriction or any undue regulation, you are making it harder in every instance to get that care, because the providers who are working with young people are probably also the same providers who are working with transgender adults. So suddenly their doctors aren't returning their calls, their appointments are getting canceled. And same with, these large hospital networks, that they're like, even if you have, as we've seen with like Catholic hospitals who have declared that they don't want to even host medical care for transgender people, even if your doctor's willing, you've gotten your letter from your therapist, your insurance is signed off. If the hospital isn't willing to actually host your surgery appointment, some people receive their hormones through like a small implant, like a little pellet you get in your arm. They aren't willing to host the implantation of that, right? So the network is the network of access to care for transgender people, which, by the way, has never been great, has always been a struggle, particularly for transgender people who experience widespread discrimination and poverty to begin with. It was always a patchwork, and it's becoming scarcer just in the 9 months since that order was issued. And that is just one action that he's taken. I list it as the most sweeping and most dire because it's the one I think is impacting the most people. you may recall that, for example, Hunter Schafer received her passport back with a gender marker on it. People online were joking that it's M for mother, it's and this can seem kind of abstract. I doubt most people have really thought about the gender that's listed on their passport. Many people may be surprised to recall their gender is even listed on their passport at all, and in fact, once upon a time,
I didn't even remember that until I saw it becoming a thing online.
Right.
But there's been more than that too, right? Like they've also others like sort of ostensibly superficial attacks that also have a subtext of menace and erasure. Like they remove like T from the LGBT T like thing on government websites too. Which is sort of like, you're not here.
Yes, and erased Sylvia Rivera and Marsha B. Johnson from the National Park Service and the Stonewall Monument, censored really any mention of transgender people across the federal government. So even like State Department travel advisories for queer travelers, scrubbing any mention of transgender person. And I think it's important because the backline to that is that it is a belief that a transgender person simply does not exist as a transgender person, that our self-determination, our self-identification, our autonomy over our own body, and over our own identity and how we're reflected in the world, the government is overriding that and assigning its own will onto us. One way you see this having real consequences is at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where a number of career officials were fired and Trump appointed his own, troglodytes to run the place and to basically turn it completely on its head and instead fighting the widespread discrimination that many people experience in the workplace on race, on sex, on disability, using it to largely go after ostensibly anti-white racism and after transgender people on the basis that our rights must be coming at the expense of someone else's. And the EEOC, when Trump was inaugurated, had dozens of cases in front of it from transgender people under the Biden administration. And before that, under Barack Obama's administration, they had begun receiving and investigating complaints about discriminatory actions in workplaces. These are people who experienced not just, accidental misgenderings and these sorts of things, but avid harassment from coworkers and from supervisors based on their gender identity. The one I remember was a transgender man who was a employee at in the Georgia state prison system, and his coworkers outed him as transgender to inmates, encouraged them to mock him and to threaten him. There was another who was a worker at a fast food chain who was being routinely sexually harassed by their coworkers. The Trump administration dropped all those, even in instances where you could say, well, never mind them being transgender, that just seems like open sexual harassment, dropped it strictly on the basis of their gender or on the basis that it was a transgender person who had filed the complaint, because the administration is not interested in making the world safer for transgender people. The end goal of all of this, everything from, banning what bathroom we use to, censoring people from putting their pronouns in their bio, like all these small things, they add up in a transgender person's life to try and make it harder for them to be out and be open. And frankly, to send a message to any closeted transgender people that this is not a safe place, if it ever was, for them to come out and begin their transition. So when I say that they're sort of attacking transgender people's existence, I think sometimes it can seem hyperbolic, right? I don't think misgendering or dead naming somebody is the same as murder. I understand that. But what it is attacking their existence as transgender people by denying them that fundamental sense of self-determination and freedom to be themselves.
So, Gillian, I want to get your take on this. It's a big question, and I'm sure there's 50 different answers that could all be correct. But how do you think we got to this point? I've been covering the radical right for a decade now, and I've always heard, especially the religious right, ragging on, they would call it SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity laws. But things really seem to have escalated. I mean, how do we get from this being a religious right niche issue that was, definitely churning in the background long before the second Trump administration to being, at the forefront of so much right-wing media. It's a day one priority for the Trump administration. Like you said, thousands of laws in state houses. What's your read on what changed, if anything?
I think that there's overlapping reasons we are where we are right now. First and foremost, I think organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom and Heritage Foundation and these other really, load-bearing organizations on the right, they are advancing a Christian nationalist worldview. And at the center of that Christian nationalist worldview is a patriarchal understanding of gender and gender roles. So not just defining who is a man or a woman, but what men and women can do, what roles should they fulfill in society. Transgender people, if we are allowed to thrive in society, we're challenging the very foundation of that mythology, right? If gender is something that is malleable based on people's self-determination, that runs entirely contrary to the idea that God made them man and woman and set out these specific roles in public life for them. I think at a little more grounded level than that, in order to bring that kind of world into existence or back into existence and to enforce it with the full force of the law, they need to do what the libertarian, I was going to say scholar, but monster might be a better word, Murray Rothbard said about repealing the 20th century. And one of the advances over the course of the 20th century and over the course of, the dawn of the second wave of feminism and forward from there was gender neutrality in the law and things like the Civil Rights Act and its protections from sex discrimination, things like Title IX, right? Things like the Fair Housing Act and, employee workplace protections and a variety of Supreme Court precedents, which has slowly expanded the definition of sex under the law to prohibit discrimination in the form of sex stereotyping, sexual harassment, right? Pregnancy discrimination, not just like narrowly discrimination against women because they are women, but broadly on the basis of their sex. And over the course of the last few decades, queer people had been winning court precedents on that same basis, that discrimination against somebody because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity is discrimination on the basis of their sex. That if you would fire a man for being married to a man, but you wouldn't fire a woman for being married to a man, you have inherently discriminated against that gay man. Or if you would fire somebody assigned male at birth for taking on a female identity, but you wouldn't do the same based on somebody assigned female at birth, or as you may deem it, of the female sex, then you are inherently making a judgment against them on the basis of their sex. In 2020, one of these cases, well, three of these cases actually, which were filed by workers who had been fired on the basis of their sexual orientation or their gender identity because they were gay or because they were trans, reached the Supreme Court. And in 2020, the Supreme Court issued a 6-3 opinion that I think surprised even many advocates who had fought for it, declaring that it was prohibited under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits sex discrimination in employment, that workplaces were prohibited by that law from firing somebody because they are gay or because they are trans. And this really terrified the right. Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, and whose wife Erin Hawley is an attorney at the Alliance Defending Freedom, called this the end of the conservative legal movement, right? And I think it really terrified the right in a new way because they had encountered Obergefell, the Supreme Court decision granting the right to same-sex marriage, as a significant blow, but I don't think they encountered it as existential because it was foundationally a right based in the right to privacy. Whereas this recognition of transgender people's discrimination within civil rights law terrified them because civil rights law governs the public, it governs the commons, right? And if transgender people have a freedom to be ourselves in public, that is a new scale of fear. And it's also doesn't take a great legal mind to see how the logic that Neil Gorsuch used to write that opinion could thus be applied to other sex non-discrimination laws, including Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination in education and in athletic programs, importantly, and Section 5057 of the Affordable Care Act, which prohibits sex discrimination in healthcare. So what did they begin doing after 2020? In 2020, they introduced, I think it was around 70 pieces of legislation in different state houses around the country, just focused on transgender rights. And people remember, past fights over bathroom bills and these sorts of things in North Carolina before that. After that Supreme Court opinion in 2020, then in 2021, that number doubles, and then doubles again in 2022, and then doubles again in 2023. Where now every year since 2023, we have seen over 500 pieces of legislation being introduced in these state houses. And these are principally being written by organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom. They develop these things called model bills. They host what are basically drill camps for legislators, like the Values Voter Summit and others, where they bring people and basically, try to sell them on this as a political crutch, as a matter of policy, and also as a matter of advancing this kind of conservative ideology. And they knew that these laws were going to be challenged in court. And what they're aiming to do is secure court precedents that cabin that 2020 ruling, Bostock v. Clayton County, to just instances where somebody was strictly fired explicitly on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, to then try and prohibit trans people from being protected from discrimination in schools, in our access to public accommodations like restrooms, further in our workplaces based on the different kind of harassment, like can workplaces refuse to gender us correctly? Can they refuse to use our new names? These sorts of things. Can they refuse to cover our healthcare? And just what was it? Just 4 months ago, I can't believe it was just 4 months ago, the Supreme Court handed them just such a victory in U.S. v. Scrimeti when it upheld laws which were banning gender-affirming medical care for transgender people under the age of 18, basically suggesting that these laws were not discriminating against transgender people. And we're now headed towards another Supreme Court case where they are considering laws banning transgender girls from participating on women and girls sports teams, which I think has become this political shibboleth for a lot of people. And I think a lot of people are maybe confused about where it's coming from and why it's suddenly one of the most critical issues in our country's politics, given that many of the states where they pass these bans have one or fewer transgender athletes. But the goal is very explicitly to secure a really broad court precedent that weakens transgender people's rights under civil rights law and the Constitution.
On that note about the trans athletes thing, isn't it also kind of a cultural issue? I'm just curious if you're, how you feel about this. There's the legislative angle, but there's been a whole bunch of changes culturally in the sense that there are more trans people in television shows and in media and in social media as well that they have access to. And I feel like that has helped stir up this obsession as well, because for the first time, there have been a lot of victories for trans people too, that I think, over the last 20 years or so. I'm just curious what you think about that, and just to what degree the cultural changes and sort of this reactionary push are related.
I try to remind people that they didn't need Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine in 2014 to tell them what a transsexual was, right? That trans person have been a focus of fascination and mockery and demonization in mass media for as long as there's been mass media. And that if you're over 35 in this country, you were likely raised to hate transgender people, even if you didn't know that. And I say that because I'm over 35, and the person I was being raised to hate was myself. So I try to challenge the idea that, the 2010s and onward had a sort of newfound visibility for transgender people. I think what changed in the 2010s is that through social media, we were able to challenge those narratives and, importantly, write them ourselves. suddenly what changed was that transgender people were not solely a source of mockery, could not solely be written off as devastated loons, sickly perverts, or absurd eunuchs. Suddenly you had to listen to us, take us seriously. We almost like came alive off the screen and started demanding things like rights and healthcare and safety. And that, I think, is really what challenged from a cultural conception. That said, looking at a lot of that period now, I'm reminded of what Kurt Vonnegut said, that all the artists and writers of the 60s and 70s used all their art and all their comedy to oppose the Vietnam War, and it had all the impact of dropping a cream pie off a stepladder. That I think that cultural change, it's not invaluable, or it doesn't lack value, but there's an artist, I'm blanking on her name, who she's a trans artist, but who says that visibility without protection is a trap. And I think we had visibility without protection. I think that that almost like a product rollout that was happening in the early 2010s, that was sort of like introducing to the world, to transgender people. It was very top down. I don't think it was ever a suitable replacement for the kinds of like organizing and cross movement building that needed done. And, certainly we're in a rush to do a lot of that work and have been in a rush to do a lot of that work now. It's not to say that work wasn't being done, to be clear. It just wasn't getting the kinds of resources that we're going to get you on red carpets and those sorts of things.
So I want to switch gears a little bit. Before you came on, we were talking a bit about how sort of the story that the right has told about transgender people has kind of morphed into something really sinister and something I think is really dangerous, which is when I started reporting and covering the religious right and stuff, the line that I heard so long is that transgenderism, they would call it an ism, right? First flag, yellow card here. They would say that it is a mental illness, and while their legal arms and everything were trying to scramble and figure out a way to prevent the expansion of civil rights to include trans people, it had this sort of disingenuous sheen of compassion that they would put over it, as good godly people, of like, these are people who are ill, and like, we shouldn't encourage this illness or whatever, which was already gross, to be clear, is already fucked up. But over the last couple years, particularly, the line for a lot of pro-Trump influencers, including members of, the federal government, has really taken a dark turn, I think, where now after every mass shooting or attack or whatever, there is this sort of scramble in right-wing media to try to claim that transgender people are responsible. People like Andy Ngo, this has been repeated by Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, call it Trantifa, right? They're trying to link their panics about transgender people with their panics about anti-fascism in the U.S. and try to portray non-heterodox gender identity or whatever, not as necessarily, a decision somebody has made that they strongly disagree with or have contempt for, but something that is akin to a form of extremism, that it is radical and dangerous. And, we've seen some sort of swirlings. It looks like the FBI is at least entertaining the idea of treating it like a form of extremism in terms of investigations and stuff. A lot of that, it's not really clear what has and hasn't panned out on that front. I'm curious your take on that, and like, does that concern you as a trans person? Like, when you're hearing that personally, I mean, is it scary? Or am I projecting, or am I feeling scared for you? What's your read?
I think, yes, it is scary because you're watching people with a lot of power basically have a psychotic break and become deeply obsessed with you when you would love to just mind your own business. I mentioned like sort of the cultural history of trans people. We are not new to being depicted as monstrous or even as violent and killers, right? And you think of the history of Norman Bates and Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, right? And I'm reading this book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is about it's a feminist history of slasher movies, which I thought would be a fun like October read. And androgyny and fears of androgyny are sort of littered across the history of horror, and really like even going further back to the idea of like monstrous births and the idea that like a mother of ill repute will give birth to or basically intersex children. And so I can't say I'm incredibly surprised to see them grasping for that language. I will say, like, I've seen them try to blame trans people for pretty much everything under the sun, but especially like public acts of violence since like 2018. And I've seen them been right out of those thousands of times precisely twice, in almost literally the way a broken clock will. And as I was reading, it was a Yale researcher, psychiatrist, who did an interview with the New York Times after one of these incidences where the person was trans, who said that somebody who commits, this heinous act of violence, who also happens to be transgender, has more in common with other mass shooters than they do with most other transgender people. That an act of violence like that is so rare among the populace and such a break in the social contract that is actually the defining line of their identity, not, are they taking the same estrogen medication as me, right? Like, and I think one of the reasons it's particularly scary is because it shows a drive to blame trans people for anything and everything, and to encourage their audience to see trans people not just as as a scary group of people. You mentioned this notion of like transgenderism or transgender ideology or just gender ideology. The goal is sort of portraying our existence and really like gender fluidity and gender nonconformity more broadly as like a kind of toxin in the air. And even if we aren't, even if we weren't the ones pulling the trigger, our existence somehow must have poisoned the culture and led these poor souls astray. A lot of this would be somewhat laughable. And after like the shooting with Charlie Kirk, where it was like, well, the shooter's trans. Okay, no, wait, the bullets are trans. No, wait, the roommate is trans. Like, obviously, they're just increasingly desperate. It's also scary because the message is, wouldn't you be able to live without fear if we just got rid of all the trans people? And bears a terrifying similarity to sort of mass panics and scapegoats of the historic past. And at a moment when transgender people are, we've always been, I think, as a population, vulnerable. We face widespread poverty. We're 4 times as likely to experience violence as our cisgender peers. We face common homelessness. We're overrepresented in the sex trade, in homeless shelters, in foster care and juvenile detention centers. But right now, we're also politically estranged, whereas politically isolated as we've been in the decades since I've been doing this work. And when I look at the ways that the sort of right-wing figures that you mentioned talk about us, I don't see a bottom. Like, I don't see a moment where they're like respecting any degree of humanity, to your point. And it's been a while since you had mentioned this like kind of like head patting, like humanitarian way that they may speak about trans people.
To be clear, I use humanitarian in air quotes there.
No, I understand.
It is the veneer of caring.
Yes, and veneer is exactly right, because what they're doing when they're suggesting like, well, these trans people are just lost or whatever else, right? Is sort of giving a nod to like elite opinion. And what they've seen is that they actually don't need elite opinion, or they don't need to be concerned about like liberal gatekeepers in this way. And over the last, especially over the last 5 years, really over the last decade, they've basically just been like pushing the line further in what they can do to us and seeing when and where they'll get pushback. And they just haven't received that much, unfortunately. And a lot of that comes from the fact that transgender people are, politically unrepresented. We're politically powerless. We're not, we are institutionally powerless. And we're not without, our own organizing power. We're not without our own abilities to keep each other safe. We're not without, senses of community and community-based organizations. But when you're facing these like mammoth right-wing organizations who can fly legislators around the country to pass all these hundreds of bills and defund all these hospitals, and it's thinking of Anna gets cream pie again. Like it feels it's definitely asymmetrical to say the least.
One thing that I thought was, that I want to bring up there, because you mentioned the lack of support ostensibly from liberals and things like that. One tactic on the right is they seem to be trying to create divisions between lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, right? To make certain, you have Andy No, who is, he's gay, right? But there's also these like gays against groomers and these type of groups that are identify as bisexual for what it's worth. There seems like a push to say like, okay, this is, we'll defend this, but we're not going to defend that. It seems to be a dividing tactic. I'm just very curious of your thoughts about that. Because I find it very upsetting to see people like Andy No, who's got like a pride flag in his, his Twitter thing, and then everything is like Trantifa and all this like dehumanizing, horrible. He might as well be a white supremacist the way he talks about trans people. I'm just curious your thoughts about that.
Well, I think there has always been within the LGBT rights movement and its various iterations over the last like 6-7 decades, since like the post-war era, there's always been a divide that I don't even think really falls along like sexual or gender lines. I think it falls along class lines first and foremost, and those themselves are structured along like your proximity to the norm of like the white Christian heterosexual male. Like there's been always people like Andrew Sullivan and sort of like the world of like gay Republicans, right? And there's one running for Lieutenant Governor of Virginia right now.
We talked about Dave Rubin on a premium episode.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, even like there was a great book by Neil J. Young called not the singer Neil Young, but the historian Neil J. Young called "Coming Out Republican," and it came out last year. And I bought it, and you think it's going to be this like quixotic history of this strange little meaningless movement. They wielded a pretty massive amount of power over the years. Like Peter Thiel is a gay Republican, right? Like, and even, they really defined the gay agenda in many ways by primarily focusing it on marriage and the military and these really conservative institutions. And a big goal of a lot of that was, in addition to, I should say, into trying to like, bring gay people into the fold of mainstream culture, mainstream society, was not just saying, look how much like you we are, but look how much unlike those people we are, right? Mm. Those radical queers who were, throwing ashes on the White House lawn.
We're the good ones.
We're the good ones, right? Yeah. And trans people were sort of always on the other end of that because we look stranger, we sound stranger, right? We're harder to grasp in many ways. And our existence cannot be cabined in the sort of private sphere way that, say, opposition to sodomy bans can, that opposition to marriage bans can. There's an almost libertarian sense to a lot of gay rights discussions, whereas trans people are fighting for our healthcare, we're fighting for safe communities, we're fighting for our freedom to be ourselves in public, which does in fact, is certainly helped by civil rights laws, which govern the public sphere. And, there's also a weird like macho sense that goes with it too. And sort of fear, like James Baldwin wrote about this, right? Like in Giovanni's Room or in Queer by William S. Burroughs. These books are 70 years old. And in each book is narrated by this like self-hating gay man, and his foil in each are these like painted ladies, these drag queens that were like hovering around the clubs of Paris or Mexico. And at each point, the narrators are saying, and I'm thinking of Daniel Craig in the movie that came out a while ago, but are saying like, oh, well, my fear was I was like them. I didn't realize that I could be gay and just a normal man. So a lot of the time, I think it's like not even along those gender lines. I think it's really trying to like define themselves as like, well, look how like posh and, middle class or upper class I can be. Look how much I can be as easily defined by the same ideals, the same conservative ideals that govern so much of society. And look how strange inherently they are. Look how distant they are, right? So to see the right trying to deploy that, one, if you look into like polling of LGBT people on like support for policies supporting trans people, they are far, far, far and away more likely to support, transgender people's inclusion in civil rights laws and things like bathrooms and even sports participation, access to healthcare, right? There's really no daylight that I see between.
They're also more likely to have met a trans person.
Yes, very much so. Yes.
Right. So that's also something.
Yes. And so I want to stress that like trans people as a population and non-transgender queer people as a population, I don't see much daylight. The organizations you cited, like GAG or whatever they're called, they are very clearly astroturfed and tried to build out. And in fact, like the Family Research Council was saying this as long ago as 2017, saying that like, well, actually the LGBT coalition is very fractured and trans people depend on LGB4 legitimacy. And I can promise the Family Research Council that we will fight for legitimacy whether others join us or not. But I do think it's important to stress that like a lot of that is kayfabe. Like I don't see a lot of that in the general population and especially frankly like all the people I'm working with now in my professional life and fighting for trans rights. What were they doing before that? They were fighting for same-sex marriage, right? They were fighting against HIV criminalization laws, right? And they will again if they have to. So I don't see that. I don't see that reflected sort of in the places that it counts. But that said, like I said, there have always been gay conservatives, and I'm sure to some degree there always will be.
You don't have to, you could pass or whatever. Like of all these horrific transphobes who are just blabbermouths online, is there anyone who irritates you the absolute most? Or do you just tune them all out?
Oh God.
Like, is there somebody you like go to hate read their feed because they're just like so insufferable, or it could be an obscure person?
No, I wish there were fewer. I think, I wish my reading habits, did not drive me to say like, gee, I wonder what I'm trying to decide who I want to dignify. I find Elon Musk's story fascinating to me because of his journey around trans rights and specifically his understanding of gender broadly, which I think is very tied to this, first off, his own narcissism. Second, the sort of pro-natalist, you have to breed as many people as possible and seeking as many male heirs as you can. It's all very Habsburg. It's all very old world. And at the center of it is his daughter, Vivian Wilson, who came out and transitioned. I have never seen people as horrified around the discourse around trans rights as they were by the way that he talks about his daughter, the way that he says that she doesn't exist, that his son, quote unquote, is dead to him, right? And people who would never speak up otherwise were like, that's an insane way for a father to talk about his daughter. And what's crazy to me is that, trans people are sort of defying our assignment and our assigned role in life, according to people like Musk and others. And Musk, who is also, an anti-union and an anti-worker boss and the world's richest man and like the face of like global capital, he is reacting to the notion of one of his own, progeny seeking self-determination and seeking her own happiness and seeking her own joy, the same way he does to a disobedient worker, or the same way he does to like, degrowth governmental policies and these sorts of things. So he provides sort of this perfect through line between transgender people's fight for own freedom and really the polycrisis that we're all enduring, including like the relationship between self-determination and self-governance, the relationship between self-determination and, your ability to exert power over your workplace, your ability to exert power over your life. I think that what transgender people are fighting for is a very fundamental, small d democratic principle around not just self-determination, but also a freedom to be weird, right? I get very uncomfortable around political conversations about where polling and these things stand. And I have to know them for my work, and I have to understand them and process them and respond to them and develop like persuasive tactics and messaging. And we can't just ignore them wholesale. But I also think that if, a free society is one where it's safe to be weird, I think I'm okay being stranger than other people. And I think most trans people know they challenge assumptions in every single room they enter. And that should be something we can do safely. That should be something we should do. The freedom to do that should be of concern for any person, because it's the foundation of the society where your own freedoms are at stake. I don't know if any of that's making sense, but
if it's a crime to be weird, this podcast is so fucked.
Well, so many people are fucked, right? I've always loved weird people. I've always loved originals. And I think as much as they want to portray us as like a cult, right? And sort of mindless, that's so far from the truth. I see every transgender person, most every transgender person I know has pursued something that the whole world was telling them not to do, and did so knowing they could lose everything. That is a commitment to authenticity and a commitment to their own sense as an individual that I think we should be cultivating in most people. And that obviously won't drive all of them to a sex change, but it might drive them towards greater self-determination over their material life, including over their body.
I just want to say before we get to the last question, Gillian just called herself weird. But of all the people in the civil rights community in general, I don't know anybody who is more professional. It's if I go to ask Gillian a question, the answer is the most professional, astute, sober-minded answer. And so I just want to say weird is relative.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't know. This is where I'm comfortable, I think. Put me in a social situation and ask me to do small talk, and then you'll see.
So we've got a closing question. I always hate it when people ask me questions like this, so I'm sorry in advance. But our listeners might be hearing all of this, be thinking, "Holy cow, that sounds terrible. This sounds awful." How can people support the trans community right now? Is there anything that comes to top of mind? I don't know if you're people ask me if what should people do about the growing far right, and I'm just I don't fucking know, dude. If I knew, I'd have $1 gazillion.
Yeah.
But yeah, is there anything just people can do in their daily life? I mean, no single podcast listener or whatever is going to be able to go knock on the door of the White House and say, "Hey man, cut it out."
I'm one of the few trans activists I know who does trans activism specifically. And what I mean by that is most of the trans people I know who are engaged in organizing or activism in some sense are working with a far broader lens, and they're organizing workplaces. They're in the the environmental movement. They're leading DSA chapters and these sorts of things, right? And they're often doing so from like a classical, like think globally, act locally sense. And I think especially right now when the power at scale seems very difficult for people to imagine capturing. It's actually at that local level where I'm pointing people. And specifically, like, one, if you want to support trans people, like I said, there are trans people in your backyard who are absolutely fighting for their own safety and dignity as trans people. They're probably also fighting for your safety and dignity, whether you know it or not. And that if you get engaged at that community level, you're going to find trans people among you, because one of the through lines for a lot of trans people is we have to challenge this a hierarchy that we're told is innate and as old as time and impenetrable. And we challenge it and defy it. And it kind of feels like magic in a lot of ways, but it also makes you realize how much other bullshit you've been tolerating, how many other hierarchies are built on bullshit. And I think, especially for listeners of a show like this, and I don't say this to put anyone down because I'm absolutely one of these people as well, it can become very easy to feel like you're doing something when you're consuming and posting and sort of engaging with these things online. But that's not actually politics as much as like we call it politics. Politics requires other people. It requires you interacting with other people. It requires you building power with other people. And to my point earlier about, sort of pop culture and trans visibility and these sorts of things, we really need to bring ourselves back down to first principles. And how do you actually build collective political power? How can you actually marshal people to challenge the material conditions around your everyday life, around your community, around your neighborhood? And I guarantee you, like I said, you will find trans people doing it there, and working with them towards that common goal is, I think, actually how trans people are going to grow safe for ourselves as well.
Gillian Branstetter, thanks for coming on, posting through it. We'll put a link to your newsletter, to your social media, all that in the description of this episode. Folks, go follow Gillian.
She's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth.
I really enjoyed talking to Gillian. I've been following her on social media, reading her work for so long. It was so nice to talk to her. Although I do wish the circumstances had been a little better.
Yeah. I mean, this is an episode that I wanted to do for a while, and they really forced our hand with all the rhetoric after Kirk's murder. It seems like I said at the time of Kirk's murder, this is just one of those events that has reverberations that kind of shift the way we talk about things. And, as soon as they pulled trans people out after that shooting as a target, I knew that we had to talk about it.
Well, I think that's about going to do us for this week. We will see you all back here on the main feed next Monday, and we'll see our Patreon supporters over on the premium feed on Thursday.
Yeah, it's going to be Jared's turn at the album recommendation.
Yeah, I feel like on the preview episodes, that's like the most pressure I feel when we're putting them together. Is I'm just
it's like a chess match. It's like every time you move
up. Just like, oh man, Mike picked something really good. Like I've been really rocking the that Earl Sweatshirt album that you recommended on the last. It's so good. It's so good. I had like stopped paying attention to Earl
melancholic
Sweatshirt
album.
Yeah, but I feel like that was always like where he was at his best. But I mean, like I totally tuned him out. I listened to Earl Sweatshirt in college a lot. Like I had a friend Jimmy, and we were like super into like Odd Future and all that. But I kind of like forgotten about him. But that album's fantastic. It's so good. So I got to pick a better album than that.
Well, we'll talk to you on Thursday, everybody, and then after that, we got a little bit of Laura Loomer coming.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
I'm just